My daughter's blood type didn't match mine on a single form the pediatrician's office sent home by mistake. I sat with that piece of paper for 2 days before I said a word to anyone. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, a man I hadn't seen in 11 years knocked on my own front door, holding a gift bag for a birthday party he hadn't been invited to. But here's what neither of them knew yet. I'd already called my brother-in-law, a genetics tech at the hospital, and asked him a question I never thought I'd have to ask about my own kid. None of that prepared me for what I'd be told 6 weeks later, sitting in a lawyer's office with a folder I never wanted to open in the first place. My name is Mark Delaney. I'm 37 years old. Let me take you back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without understanding what our marriage actually looked like before that piece of paper showed up. Jennifer and I met at a friend's wedding in Lincoln, 12 years before any of this, and married 2 years after that. She came from money, not obscene money, but the kind that meant her parents had paid for the wedding without blinking, the kind that meant her father had opinions about our first house that carried more weight in the decision than mine did. I taught high school history and coached JV football. Jennifer sold real estate, and sold it well, moving up fast into the kind of listings that made her the primary earner in our house within a few years. I told myself that didn't matter. For a long time, I mostly believed it. The truth is, from the start, most of the big decisions in our marriage ran through Jennifer's family in one way or another: where we lived, which schools our kids would attend, even the color we painted the living room, because her mother had opinions about resale value. I went along with most of it. I told myself I was easygoing, low maintenance, the kind of husband who didn't need to win every argument to feel secure in a marriage. Looking back, I wasn't easygoing. I was avoiding a fight I didn't think I could win, and calling the avoidance a virtue instead. We had Ben first, 10 years ago now, and Sophie 3 years after him, a family that looked, from any reasonable outside angle, complete and stable. I coached Ben's Pop Warner team on weekends. I helped Sophie with her reading most nights, the two of us on the couch with a picture book, her small hand tracing the words. I built my whole sense of being a good father, maybe my whole sense of being needed at all, around those evenings. I liked being needed. I think, if I'm honest, I needed to be needed more than I ever let myself examine. Jennifer's college years came up rarely in conversation. She'd gone to a small liberal arts school in Missouri before transferring to finish her degree closer to home, and she talked about that first school the way people talk about a phase they've mostly outgrown. A boyfriend from back then, Tyler, came up maybe twice in our entire marriage, always in the same flat, closed-off tone people use for a subject they've decided isn't worth reopening. I never asked follow-up questions. I had no reason to. Whatever had happened in Missouri felt, from where I stood, like it belonged to a version of Jennifer I'd never met and didn't need to. Sophie was born with a shock of dark hair that neither Jennifer nor I had, not unusual for a newborn, the pediatrician assured us. Hair color settles in over the first year. It did settle, eventually, into a chestnut brown that didn't quite match mine or Jennifer's, but close enough that I never thought about it again. Kids look like a blend sometimes. I'd heard that 100 times from other parents and believed it without a second thought. If I'm naming the first thing I should have paid closer attention to, it's probably that, not because hair color proves anything on its own, but because I remember Jennifer's mother commenting on it once, at a family dinner, in a tone just slightly too careful for the subject. I noticed the carefulness. I let it pass. Jennifer's father died the winter Sophie turned 5, and something in Jennifer changed afterward in a way I understood, at the time, as ordinary grief. She became harder to reach some evenings, quieter at dinner, distracted in a way that seemed explainable by loss alone. I picked up more of the parenting that year without either of us discussing it, made lunches, ran carpools, sat through the reading time on the couch even on nights I was exhausted from coaching. I told myself I was holding things together for her, the way I always had, and that this was simply what a good husband did during a hard season. I didn't ask her what she actually needed that year. I assumed I already knew, because assuming had always worked well enough before. Around the same time, Jennifer reconnected with some old college friends on social media, a detail I only registered in passing, a comment here, a tagged photo there, nothing that struck me as unusual for someone processing a father's death by reaching back toward an earlier, less complicated version of her own life. I had no idea, watching her scroll through those old photos on the couch some evenings, that one particular name from that platform was about to walk back into our lives entirely, or that a routine pediatrician's paperwork error the following spring would be the thing that finally made me ask the questions I should have asked years earlier. Spring came, and with it the annual physicals, Ben's for football clearance, Sophie's just the routine well-child visit every 7-year-old gets. Nothing about that week felt different from any other year. Jennifer took the kids to the pediatrician while I covered practice. That evening, she mentioned, almost as an aside while unloading the dishwasher, that Sophie's numbers all looked good, nothing to worry about. I said something equally unremarkable back. We moved on to whether Ben needed new cleats. I didn't think about that appointment again until 3 weeks later, when the office's billing system sent home duplicate paperwork by mistake, a full copy of Sophie's chart, something that should have stayed in a file cabinet, stapled instead to a reminder postcard about summer vaccinations. I wasn't looking for anything. I was standing at the kitchen counter, sorting mail into the recycling, when the blood type line caught my eye the way a wrong note catches your ear in a song you know well. Oh, positive. I'm a negative. Jennifer's a positive. I stood there a long moment, running the numbers the way I might run a lesson plan, telling myself there had to be a version of basic genetics where this still made sense. I wasn't sure there was. I also wasn't sure enough to trust my own half-remembered high school biology over the actual chart in my hand. I didn't say anything to Jennifer that night. I told myself I needed to check the science before I turned a form into an accusation. My brother-in-law Dave, Jennifer's cousin actually, worked as a genetics tech at the regional hospital, someone I'd golfed with a handful of times but never called out of the blue. I called him the next afternoon, keeping my voice as level as I could manage, framed the whole thing as idle curiosity, a coworker's paperwork mix-up. I said, nothing about us. Dave walked me through it plainly, the way people do when they don't know they're detonating something. 2 A-negative parents, he said, can't produce an O-positive child. It's not likely. It's not possible. I thanked him. I hung up. I sat in my truck in the school parking lot for 20 minutes before I could make myself drive home. That was the first time the floor actually dropped, not just tilted. Every ordinary evening from the last 7 years rearranged itself in my head in the space of that 20 minutes, and none of the new arrangement made any sense yet. I didn't confront Jennifer that week. I told myself I needed more before I said anything, that a paperwork error and a phone call weren't proof of anything specific, only that something didn't add up. I filed the form in my truck's glove compartment, under an old owner's manual, and went back inside to help Ben with his math homework like the entire foundation of my family hadn't just shifted under my feet an hour earlier. Sophie asked me that same week why I kept looking at her funny. I told her I wasn't, that I was just tired from work. She accepted that the way 7-year-olds accept most adult explanations, and went back to drawing, and I stood in the doorway of her room a beat too long, something tightening in my chest that I didn't yet have language for. I started noticing things I'd apparently trained myself not to notice for years. The way Jennifer's mother had once commented, too carefully, on Sophie's hair. The way Jennifer occasionally used a name, Tyler, with a kind of practiced flatness that I'd always read as closure, and now read as something else entirely. I still didn't say anything. I told myself I was being methodical. The truth was closer to fear. I wasn't ready to hear whatever answer was waiting on the other side of the question. The knock at the door came on a Thursday, 10 days after the phone call with Dave, while I was setting up for Sophie's birthday party in the backyard. Jennifer answered it. I heard an unfamiliar voice, warm, easy, the kind of voice that assumes it's welcome somewhere. I came around the side of the house in time to see a man about my age handing Jennifer a gift bag, the two of them standing a half-step closer than strangers stand, something unspoken passing between them that I couldn't have named yet but felt immediately, low in my stomach. Mark, Jennifer said, turning, her voice pitched a half-tone higher than normal. "This is Tyler. An old friend from Missouri." I shook his hand. I don't remember what I said. I remember that his eyes went, almost involuntarily, past me toward the backyard, toward the party, toward Sophie running past in a birthday crown, and something in his expression lingered there a half-second too long for a man meeting a child for the first time. I filed that too. I was getting very good, by that point, at filing things instead of asking about them. The party went on around us, ordinary and loud, kids on a bounce house, parents making small talk over lemonade, and I moved through the rest of that afternoon on autopilot, watching Tyler from across the yard more than I let myself watch anything else. He left before cake, said something about another commitment, hugged Jennifer goodbye a beat longer than the occasion called for. I want to stay with this a second, because what I watched happen in our backyard that afternoon is the part of this whole story I still can't fully explain, even now, but you'll understand why once you see what that same man's presence was about to cost all four of us. That night, after the kids were asleep, Jennifer mentioned Tyler had moved back to Omaha for work, mentioned it lightly, like a detail not worth dwelling on. I asked how long he'd been back. "A few months," she said, already turning toward the sink, already changing the subject to whether we needed more streamers for next year. A few months. Which meant he'd been back in the city, in our city, for roughly the same stretch of time that Jennifer's evenings had started going quiet, that her phone had started angling itself away from me on the counter, that I'd chalked up entirely to grief over her father. I didn't say any of that out loud. I went to bed that night with the blood type form still sitting in my glove compartment, and a name, Tyler, now sitting in my chest in a way it never had before, and I had no idea, lying there in the dark, how much closer those two things were about to come together than I'd let myself imagine. I didn't sleep much that week. I lay awake running the math over and over. Sophie was 7, which meant conception had happened almost 8 years ago, back when Jennifer and I had already been married 2 years. If Tyler had only just moved back to Omaha, the timeline didn't fit. It couldn't have been recent. That thought should have been reassuring. It wasn't. It just meant the question I was actually asking was older and worse than I'd first assumed. I pulled our old calendar app archives that weekend, going back 8 years, looking for anything, a trip, a weekend Jennifer had been away, a gap I might have missed at the time because I hadn't been looking for one. I found a work conference in Kansas City, for days, dated almost exactly 9 months before Sophie was born. Jennifer had gone alone. I remembered it vaguely, a real estate certification course, unremarkable, the kind of trip she took a few times a year. I sat with that a long time. A conference wasn't proof of anything. It also wasn't nothing. I called Dave again, a different question this time, careful about how I phrased it. Could a DNA test settle something like this quietly, without going through a doctor's office where word might get back to family? He gave me the name of an independent lab downtown, said people used it for all kinds of private matters, no judgment in his voice, no questions about why I was asking. I thanked him and didn't explain further. I didn't do anything with that information for another 10 days. I told myself I was still gathering more before I acted. The truth was simpler than that. Some part of me still wanted an explanation that wouldn't require the test at all, and I kept hoping one would surface on its own. Jennifer's behavior shifted in ways I started actually cataloging instead of dismissing. She left her phone in her purse now instead of on the counter, a habit that hadn't existed a month earlier. She mentioned Tyler exactly once more that week, in a context so carefully neutral, something about a mutual friend's promotion, that the neutrality itself felt engineered. Ben noticed something too, in the specific way 10-year-olds notice tension without being able to name it. He asked me one night, while we were tossing a football in the backyard, if Mom and I were getting a divorce. I told him no, that everything was fine, and watched him look at me with the same expression I'd once seen on Sophie's face, a kid clocking that the adults weren't being fully honest with him. I hated lying to him. I did it anyway, the same way I'd been doing it to myself for weeks. Karen, my mother, called that week, the way she did most Sundays, and somewhere in the conversation she asked, offhand, whether Jennifer's old boyfriend had settled back into town all right. She'd heard about it from a mutual acquaintance at church. I asked her how long she'd known Tyler was back. "Since around Christmas, I think," she said. "Why? Christmas?" "For months before I'd ever laid eyes on him in my own backyard. For months of Jennifer knowing, saying nothing, while I filed away charger cords and strange text previews that never actually existed in this story but somehow felt like they should have, because that's how much I'd already convinced myself something didn't add up. I didn't tell my mother anything else. I hung up and sat with the new timeline a long while, feeling the ground shift again, in a slightly different direction than before. I want to be honest about the theory I built that week, because it turned out to be wrong, and understanding why matters. I convinced myself, for several days, that this was recent, that Tyler's return to Omaha had reopened something old and dormant, that whatever was happening now was the real betrayal, separate from Sophie entirely, a fresh wound layered on top of an old and irrelevant history. I told myself Sophie's paternity might still have an innocent explanation I hadn't found yet, a lab error, a filing mix-up, anything that let me keep both truths, my daughter and my marriage, intact at the same time. That theory held for almost a week. It fell apart on a Tuesday, when I finally opened the glove compartment, pulled out the blood type form, and drove downtown to the lab Dave had told me about, on my lunch break, telling the school office I had a dentist appointment. I got a cheek swab kit for Sophie and one for myself, no explanation required beyond a signature and a fee. I told Jennifer that evening I was taking Sophie for a follow-up dental cleaning the next afternoon, the kind of small lie that had become alarmingly easy to produce by that point in my life. Sophie sat in the passenger seat of my truck outside the lab, swinging her legs, asking why the doctor wanted to swab the inside of her cheek instead of her arm like at the regular pediatrician. I told her some doctors just do things differently. She accepted that, the way she accepted most things I told her, with the kind of trust that made the whole errand feel worse than I'd braced for. I mailed both kits that same afternoon. The lab said 6 weeks for full results, faster for a partial. I didn't tell anyone what I'd done, not Jennifer, not my mother, not Dave. 3 weeks in, waiting, I noticed something that didn't fit the theory I'd been building. Jennifer had started deleting her browser history nightly, a habit visible only because our laptop was shared and I happened to open it one evening looking for a recipe. Not incriminating on its own. Just new, and specific, and exactly the kind of thing a person does when they're managing more than one secret at once. I still didn't confront her. I told myself the test results would tell me everything I needed to know, and that until they arrived, anything I said to her would only be half-informed and easy for her to talk her way around. That was true. It was also, again, the same old habit wearing a more reasonable-sounding excuse, waiting instead of asking, because waiting had never once cost me anything before, and I hadn't yet learned that this time, it already had. I had no idea, mailing those swabs off with Sophie humming in the passenger seat beside me, that the results waiting 6 weeks out weren't even going to be the hardest thing I'd learn that summer, that the harder truth was going to come from somewhere I hadn't thought to look at all. The 6 weeks stretched longer than any 6 weeks I'd lived through. I coached summer conditioning drills on autopilot, helped Ben with his batting stance without really watching the swing, sat through Sophie's reading time on the couch every night with a knot in my chest I couldn't set down. I lost weight without trying to. Jennifer commented on it once, said I looked tired, asked if something was wrong at school. I told her fall sports planning was stressful. She accepted that the way I'd been accepting her explanations for months, and I hated how easily the lie came out of me, how much practice I'd apparently gotten at it. 3 weeks into the wait, I followed Jennifer on a Saturday she'd said was reserved for open houses. I told myself I wasn't spying, that I was simply driving past a listing of hers to see the yard sign, an errand that happened to take me past a coffee shop where her car sat parked out front for well over an hour, far longer than any open house required. I didn't go in. I sat across the street in my truck, engine off, and watched through the window as she sat across a small table from Tyler, both of them leaning in, her hand resting briefly on his forearm before she pulled it back like she'd caught herself. I didn't need a DNA test to know what I was looking at. I already had it. What I still didn't have was how far back it went, or what it meant for Sophie specifically, and that gap was the only thing keeping me in that driver's seat instead of walking across the street. I drove home without confronting her. I told myself the same thing I'd been telling myself for weeks, that showing my hand before the test results came back would only hand her time to build a story I couldn't fully dismantle. I understand now that this had stopped being strategy a long time before that Saturday. It had just become the shape fear takes when it wants to look like patience. Dave called 2 days later, said the lab had reached out to him directly with a partial result, faster than the full report, since he'd made the original referral. He read me the number over the phone, flat and clinical, the way genetics techs are trained to deliver information that isn't theirs to feel anything about. 0% probability of paternity. I didn't say much. I thanked him, the same absurd politeness I seemed to produce automatically whenever the worst news of my life arrived by phone, and hung up, and sat in my truck in the school parking lot for the second time that summer, staring at nothing. I had the printout in my hand within the hour, driving to the lab myself instead of waiting for the mailed copy. I sat in the parking lot and read it twice, then a third time, like the words might rearrange themselves into something survivable if I looked long enough. They didn't. I didn't go home that night. I drove to my mother's house instead, sat at her kitchen table, and told her everything, the blood type form, Dave, the test, the coffee shop, all of it, in an order that probably didn't make much sense but that she absorbed without interrupting once. I always wondered, Karen said quietly, when I finished. About the hair. I shouldn't have kept that to myself. I told myself it wasn't mine to say. Another person who'd known, or half known, and stayed quiet. I was starting to understand that I'd spent the last decade surrounded by people managing a truth around me instead of with me, and that I'd built the exact kind of trusting, non-confrontational life that made that possible. I stayed at my mother's that night. I told Jennifer I was helping her with a plumbing issue, another lie, seamless by now, and I lay awake in my old childhood bedroom running through what I actually knew. Sophie wasn't mine, biologically. The affair, or whatever it had actually been, traced back at least 8 years, to a conference in Kansas City I'd never questioned. Tyler had reappeared in Omaha months before I'd ever met him, and Jennifer had known and said nothing. My own mother had suspected something for years and stayed silent, the way people in this family apparently did, out of some inherited instinct to smooth things over rather than ask. The test result was the piece I'd been holding back on using, and I still didn't use it right away. For 2 more days I carried it in my bag, unopened to Jennifer, unspoken between us, while I moved through ordinary evenings, dinner, homework, Sophie's bedtime story, with the knowledge sitting in my chest like a stone I hadn't set down anywhere yet. I want to be honest that I almost told her on the second night, standing in the kitchen while she loaded the dishwasher, the printout folded in my back pocket the entire time. I got as far as saying her name, twice, before Ben came downstairs asking about a permission slip, and the moment passed, and I told myself I'd find a better time. There wasn't going to be a better time. I understood that even as I let the moment go. What finally moved me wasn't courage. It was Sophie, that same week, asking me out of nowhere why she didn't have my nose like Ben did. I told her people and families look different sometimes, an answer that felt like the truest and most dishonest thing I'd said in weeks at the same time. I called the lawyer's office the next morning and made an appointment for the following Tuesday. I didn't tell Jennifer why. I told her it was about updating our wills, a lie so far removed from the truth it almost felt like a mercy, for both of us, for the 3 more days it bought me before everything came apart at once. I had no idea, sitting in that lawyer's waiting room 3 days later, that the conversation I was about to have wouldn't just confirm what I already knew, it would reveal that Jennifer's silence over the past 8 years had never really been about protecting me at all. I asked Jennifer to meet me at the house Tuesday evening instead of the lawyer's office. I wanted this conversation to happen somewhere real, not across a conference table with a stranger taking notes. Karen took the kids for the night, no explanation offered beyond a hug that lasted a beat longer than usual. Jennifer came home to an empty house except for me, the kitchen table cleared of everything except the folded lab report and the pediatrician's paperwork I'd kept in my glove compartment for 2 months. She saw the papers before she saw my face. I watched something in her shut down, fast, like a door closing on instinct. "Sit down," I said. "I want you to explain this to me. From the beginning. Mark, whatever you think this is. Sit down, Jennifer." She sat. I slid the lab report across the table without a word. She looked at it a long moment, and I watched her reach, almost immediately, for the smallest version of an answer. "This doesn't mean what you think it means," she said. "There could be a lab error. These things happen. I had it run twice. Same lab, same result. 0%. Mark. How long have you known Tyler was back in town?" Her hands were flat on the table now, very still. "Since Christmas." "It's not, we weren't seeing each other. We just reconnected. As friends. I watched you at the coffee shop 3 weeks ago. Your hand was on his arm." Something in her face changed, not surprise that I knew, I realized, but relief, almost, that she didn't have to keep managing the gap between what I knew and what she'd been telling me. "Fine," she said. "Yes. We started seeing each other again, a few months ago. But that has nothing to do with," she gestured at the paper, "with this. This is old. This is from before any of that. Then tell me what it actually is." She was quiet a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost the careful edge it started with. She finally spoke. This is what she told me. "I met Tyler for a weekend in Kansas City, that real estate conference, almost 9 years ago now. My father had just told me, that same week, that the business wasn't going to me, he was leaving it to my cousin instead, said I wasn't ready, and I remember feeling like nothing I'd built on my own actually counted for anything to him. Tyler and I had unfinished business from college, and I told myself one night wouldn't matter, that it was just about feeling like myself again for a few hours. I found out I was pregnant 6 weeks later and did the math and knew, immediately, that it could be either of you. I told myself it didn't matter which, I loved you, I wanted our marriage, and I decided the timing worked out close enough that no one would ever need to know. That was the first lie I told myself to make it survivable. Every year after that I got better at not thinking about it, until Tyler moved back and I saw Sophie's face in his at that first birthday party and couldn't stop thinking about it again. I never planned to tell you. I told myself protecting you from this was the same as protecting our family, and for a long time I believed that. I couldn't look at her baby pictures some nights without feeling sick. I tried to end things with Tyler in the spring, I actually did, for almost 2 months, and then he came to the party, and I let it start again anyway, because some part of me had already decided keeping this secret for 8 years meant I might as well keep living inside it. I sat with that a long moment. 9 years of a decision she'd made alone, in a hotel room in Kansas City, and 8 years of watching me build a life around a child she'd known, at least statistically, might not be mine. "You knew," I said. "From the beginning. You didn't find out with me. You've known this whole time and let me build everything on top of it. I know how that sounds. I introduced you to your own certainty about it. That's not the same as an accident, Jennifer. That's a decision you made and kept making, every single day, for 8 years." She didn't argue with that. She sat with her hands still flat on the table, and for the first time since I'd sat down, she looked less like someone managing a story and more like someone finally out of ways to manage it. "What happens now?" she said quietly. "I don't know yet," I said. "I know I'm not staying in a house built on this. I know that much." She reached for my hand across the table, the same gesture I'd have once accepted without thinking. I pulled it back before she got there. The house was quiet after that in a way I'd never heard it before, not the ordinary quiet of a sleeping house, but something hollowed out, emptied of whatever certainty had held it together for a decade. Jennifer cried at the table for a long while. I sat across from her and let her, the lab report between us the whole time, not offering anything either of us could have called comfort. I had no idea, sitting there in that silence, how much of the next year would be shaped by a single sentence I hadn't said yet, the one I'd finally say to a lawyer 3 days later, and the one that would end up costing Jennifer far more than the marriage itself. I filed for divorce that Friday. I also filed for full custody of Ben, and asked the court to establish a parenting arrangement for Sophie that kept her in my life regardless of biology. She was my daughter in every way that had ever mattered to either of us, and nothing in that report changed what 7 years of bedtime stories had built between us. Jennifer didn't contest custody of Ben. She fought harder, initially, on Sophie's arrangement, until her own attorney apparently advised her that contesting a father who wanted more time with a child, not less, would not read well to any judge in the state of Nebraska. She dropped it within a month. Tyler didn't stay in the picture for long. Jennifer told me later, in one of the few civil conversations we managed that year, that he'd stopped answering her calls within weeks of the divorce filing becoming public record, the reality of a paternity case and 2 custody battles apparently less appealing to him than a reconnection over coffee had been. He moved out of Omaha again by winter. Nobody I knew heard where. Jennifer's mother, who'd once commented too carefully on Sophie's hair at a family dinner years earlier, stopped speaking to her for the better part of that year, not over the affair itself, Jennifer told me, but over the years of silence that came before it, the same silence Karen had confessed to me at her kitchen table. Whatever standing Jennifer had once had in that family, built on money and certainty and the assumption that things would always resolve in her favor, thinned out considerably once the certainty turned out to have been false the whole time. She kept her real estate business, at least. That was the one thing that survived mostly intact, though even that took a hit locally once the story made its way, in pieces, through people who knew people. A small city holds on to things like that longer than anyone wants it to. I got the house. I got Ben most of the week. I got Sophie every bit as much as the court would allow a non-biological father to legally claim, which turned out, once everyone stopped arguing, to be nearly everything I'd asked for. I started sleeping through the night again sometime around the following spring, close to a year after that lab report first landed on our kitchen table. I hadn't realized how long it had been since a full night had felt ordinary instead of like something I was bracing to survive. I met Natalie the following summer, a nurse from Sophie's pediatric clinic, of all places, who caught me in the parking lot after an appointment and asked, plainly, if I wanted to grab coffee sometime, no games attached to the question. I said yes. It was the first uncomplicated yes I remembered saying in longer than I wanted to admit. Sophie asked me once, that fall, why she didn't have my nose like Ben did, the same question that had first cracked something open in me over a year earlier. I told her, this time, the fuller version, gently, in language a 7-year-old could hold on to, that being someone's dad wasn't about matching parts, it was about who showed up every single day, and that I intended to keep showing up for exactly as long as she needed me to. She thought about that for a second, then asked if that meant Natalie might show up too, someday. I told her maybe. She seemed satisfied with that and went back to her homework, and I stood in the doorway a moment longer than the question required, something loosening in my chest instead of tightening for the first time in longer than I could remember. I heard, the following spring, that Jennifer's business had lost its biggest client, a developer who'd apparently decided, after everything became common local knowledge, that he preferred an agent whose name wasn't attached to quite so much talk. I didn't take any satisfaction in hearing it. I just noticed that the version of Jennifer who'd once told me the power in our marriage had always run through her family's certainty was now the one standing on considerably less solid ground than I was. I could have stayed angry about all of it, the 9 years, the silence, the fact that even my own mother had known something and said nothing. I chose, somewhere around that spring, to set most of that weight down instead. It didn't happen all at once. It happened the way most real things happen, in small ordinary moments, a full night's sleep, a yes I meant, a question from my daughter I could finally answer honestly. On a Sunday that following winter, Natalie came over for dinner for the first time, and Sophie insisted on setting the table herself, 4 places instead of 3, without anyone asking her to. I watched her do it from the kitchen doorway, something settling into place that I hadn't known was still missing until I saw it happen. I picked up the framed photo from Sophie's last birthday party, the one from the backyard, before any of this, taken the same afternoon Tyler had first walked back into our lives, and set it gently in a drawer instead of on the shelf where it had always sat. Not to erase it. Just to make room for whatever came next. That's my story. A billing mix-up, a lab report with a number I read 3 times, a photo I finally moved to a drawer instead of a shelf. I've had a long time to think about what it taught me, and a few things never really left me. There was the hair color I noticed and let go of years before any of this started. I know now that the things we tell ourselves are probably nothing, are usually the first thing worth actually asking about. There was also the whole habit of waiting for proof before I ever asked a direct question, the coffee shop I sat outside of instead of walking into. I understand now that patience and avoidance can look identical from the inside, and only time tells you honestly which one you were actually practicing. And underneath everything, I learned that being needed by your kids has nothing to do with whose blood runs in them, it has everything to do with who keeps showing up, one ordinary evening at a time, long after the easier man would have stopped. Have you ever found out that something you built your whole identity around wasn't quite what you thought it was, and had to figure out what still mattered once the dust settled? Thank you for staying with me through this one. If it stirred up anything of your own, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. I read every one. See you in the next story.